from the abacus to AI. Embark on a voyage through the evolution of computing. Part 1. The Seeds of Computation, c. 3000 BCE, early 19th century. A swirl of dust blew across the market in ancient Mesopotamia. Under the shimmering sun, a merchant wearing a simple robe placed small clay counters onto a row of grooves carved into a wooden board. His neighbor, similarly attired, did the same. Barley, sheep, cloth, prices shifted with each token slid this way or that. Although neither man knew it, they were participating in the earliest form of digital computing. This rudimentary device, an ancestor of the abacus, quietly set humanity on a path that would lead to smartphones, supercomputers, and the internet. The first sparks, abacus and counting boards. The notion of systematically recording numbers can be traced back thousands of years. Sumerians used small clay tokens for counting, and as trade networks grew, the need for calculation techniques soared. Over time, the abacus emerged in various civilizations, Chinese, Roman, Greek, providing traders and tax collectors with a means to add and subtract large sums quickly. Even though it was just beads on rods, the abacus was a technological marvel of its era. One Chinese legend has a fabled student abacus champion challenging a traveling monk in a calculation race. The champion, well versed in abacus techniques, flicked the beads in a blur. With each click, his total soared closer to the final answer. The monk, calmly scribbling with an early brush on bamboo strips, produced the same answer, but only after painstaking effort. The crowd gasped in amazement at how the simple yet ingenious device could expedite commerce. Little did these onlookers suspect that centuries later, counting would evolve from beads on rods to spinning gears, vacuum tubes, and eventually integrated circuits billions of times more complex than any simple bead. Mechanical dreams, Pascal, Leibniz, and the birth of the calculator. Jump forward to mid-17th century France. A brilliant young man named Blaise Pascal, known for his philosophical and mathematical contributions, invented a gear-based calculator to help his tax collector father tally numbers more efficiently. Pascal's Pascaline, as it came to be known, was a box with gears and dials. Turning one dial would increment the next dial once it passed a certain threshold. The design looked a bit like a timepiece. Imagine Pascal hunched over his desk by candlelight, muttering about how each gear needed to fit precisely. Every time the device jammed, he would sigh, disassemble the machine, and carefully file down the teeth. Though the Pascaline was never mass-produced in the modern sense, it signaled that the conceptual leap from using an abacus to building mechanical devices could be achieved. Not long after Pascal's endeavor, a German polymath named Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz took the idea further. He recognized not just the mechanical possibility, but the philosophical elegance of creating a machine that could do more than simply add and subtract. In 1673, Leibniz demonstrated a stepped reckoner that employed a stepped drum mechanism. He famously declared, "It is unworthy of excellent men to lose hours like slaves in the labor of calculation." To him, humans ought to be free to pursue creative thought, leaving menial calculations to machines. Though these early calculators were fragile, expensive, and often inaccurate, they laid critical groundwork. They captured something intangible, a promise that mechanical contraptions could systematically handle numbers in a way that might eventually surpass human dexterity. Weaving the future, Jacquard loom, and programmable ideas. It might seem a great leap to jump from mechanical calculators to a loom, but in the early 19th century, Joseph-Marie Jacquard invented a power loom that used punch cards to create complex patterns in woven cloth. Each card's pattern of holes dictated how threads were lifted or lowered, effectively programming the loom. Picture a busy 19th century French weaving workshop, wooden looms clacking and rattling all day, threads of scarlet, gold, and emerald shimmering under lantern light. Jacquard's loom, outfitted with a series of perforated cards, caused one row of threads to rise and another to fall at precisely the correct moment to produce a floral motif or a delicate tapestry. All of a sudden, weaving an intricate pattern didn't require the same specialized skill. It simply required swapping out the punch card sequence. This innovation, while purely mechanical, offered a metaphor for how instructions could be embedded into a physical medium to direct a machine's actions. Punch cards would later resurface in the 20th century to guide computers carrying lines of encoded data. The parallel was clear. Just as the loom followed instructions from a series of cards, a future machine might follow instructions for calculations or logic. Charles Babbage and the difference engine. Enter Charles Babbage, an English polymath, mathematician, inventor and dreamer, often hailed as the father of the computer. In the early 19th century, Babbage envisioned mechanical devices that could compute mathematical tables. At the time, such tables, vital for navigation, astronomy and engineering, were laboriously computed by hand, frequently riddled with errors. Babbage's difference engine aimed to automate the process. Babbage's workshop was crowded with half-finished cogwheels, rods, and partial prototypes. He was known for his temper. An anecdote has him chasing away street musicians outside his home, hollering about their infernal racket, interrupting his thought process. Despite the chaos, he believed in his dream of a mechanical calculating machine that, once set with the correct initial values, would churn out results with near-perfect accuracy. Though Babbage received government funding, the machine proved too expensive and intricate to complete in his lifetime. Precision metalworking of that era wasn't up to the challenge of producing thousands of precise parts cheaply. While the difference engine never came to full fruition, it was a tangible stepping stone. Babbage's obsession with the idea of automatic calculation would spark further development, and in doing so, he left a conceptual legacy that directly influenced future generations. Ada Lovelace, the first programmer. Any mention of Babbage must be followed by Augusta Ada Byron King, Countess of Lovelace, commonly referred to as Ada Lovelace. The daughter of the poet Lord Byron, Ada had a fiercely inquisitive mind. She studied mathematics under Mary Somerville and became enthralled by Babbage's designs. When Babbage was invited to lecture in Turin, an Italian engineer, Luigi Menabrea, wrote a paper on the proposed analytical engine, a more ambitious machine than the difference engine. Lovelace translated Menabrea's paper into English, but added elaborate notes that tripled its length. In these notes, she described how the analytical engine could be used for tasks beyond mere arithmetic, famously illustrating how the engine could compute Bernoulli numbers. This plan, widely considered the first computer program, established Lovelace as arguably the first computer programmer. She wrote passionately that such a machine might act upon other things besides number, suggesting it could potentially handle any symbolic manipulation, music, text, or anything representable by logic. This was a radical insight. Most mathematicians of the time saw Babbage's contraption as a fancy calculating tool. Lovelace, however, glimpsed the dawn of a new age of programmable general-purpose machines. Tragically, neither Babbage's analytical engine nor Ada's programs saw the light of day in a practical sense. Their ideas, however, lay dormant like seeds awaiting the right conditions. By the time the 19th century ended, mechanical calculators had proven themselves in small ways, but the truly transformative devices had yet to appear. Transition to the 20th century. The 19th century closed with a sense of both triumph and frustration. In various corners of Europe, small businesses were selling mechanical calculators that resembled ornate music boxes. Governments and universities were becoming more reliant on arithmetic devices to handle official tasks. Still, nobody had yet built a fully automated all-purpose computing machine. Meanwhile, the Industrial Revolution churned forward. In rail yards and factories, new machines were taking over tasks once reliant on manual labor. Steam power, and later electricity, promised leaps in productivity. Society's appetite for invention kept growing. The seeds planted by Pascal, Leibniz, Jacquard, Babbage, and Lovelace were waiting for the right technological soil and climate to bloom. It would take new wars, new needs, and a global wave of scientific breakthroughs to truly ignite the revolution that Babbage and Lovelace had only theorized. In the next century, emerging fields such as electromagnetism and binary logic would combine with the demands of warfare, cryptography, and big business to propel computing from theoretical possibility to triumphant reality. Beneath the faint glow of gas lamps and the clatter of horse-drawn carriages, the world edged closer to a future beyond the wildest dreams of those ancient abacus users. The stage was set for the next act: the electrification of computation, the arrival of Turing, and the unstoppable cascade of digital miracles that would transform the planet. Part 2. Enter electricity, the foundations of modern computing, early 20th century, World War II. As the 20th century dawned, there was a palpable excitement around the potential of electricity. Factories hummed, cities glimmered with electric lights, and telegraph lines crisscrossed nations. This was an era when the word radio carried an almost magical allure, and science itself was leaping forward with discoveries in quantum mechanics and relativity. Tucked among these grand developments, the gears of computing were quietly engaging, from mechanical to electromechanical. Before true electronic computers emerged, a hybrid domain of electromechanical devices took shape. These machines still used mechanical parts, relays, rotating shafts, and gears, but they incorporated electrical impulses to control and power operations. A notable example was the tabulating machine invented by Hermann Hollerith. In the late 19th century, Hollerith's punch card system revolutionized data processing, particularly for the 1890 US Census. Instead of laboriously counting population data by hand, census workers used punch cards that encoded information about age, gender, occupation, and so forth. The cards were fed into Hollerith's machine, which could read the holes through electrical contacts. Once recognized, the machine would increment mechanical counters. This approach drastically cut down the time required to compile census results, from nearly 7 years for the 1880 census to under 3 years for the 1890 census, despite a growing population. There's a story, though perhaps apocryphal, of a young clerk eagerly feeding stacks of punch cards into one of Hollerith's tabulators, only to discover that any small misalignment caused catastrophic jams. The ruckus of a jam was enough to bring an entire office to a standstill. It was a reminder that early computing systems, for all their brilliance, often required a fussy dance of hardware and technique. In 1911, Hollerith's firm merged with other companies to form the Computing Tabulating Recording Company, which in 1924 became International Business Machines, or IBM. Over the next few decades, IBM would evolve into a commercial powerhouse that shaped the trajectory of computing. The theoretical giants, Boole and Shannon. Even as punch card machines buzzed away, a more abstract development was unfolding in the realm of mathematics and logic. In the mid-19th century, George Boole published The Mathematical Analysis of Logic, 1847, and An Investigation of the Laws of Thought, 1854. Boole's big idea was that logical statements, true or false, could be manipulated like algebraic expressions. His approach, now known as Boolean algebra, laid the groundwork for all modern digital logic. Fast forward to the 20th century, when an MIT graduate student named Claude Shannon wrote a thesis in 1937 that applied Boolean algebra to electrical circuits. Shannon proved that switches in a circuit could represent binary logic: on, 1, or off, 0. This insight was monumental. It meant that logical operations could be performed by electrical relays, or later, vacuum tubes and transistors. It was as if Shannon had whispered the blueprint for how computers could be built at scale. Relays and the coming storm of war. In the 1930s and early 1940s, as the Great Depression weighed on economies and geopolitical tensions grew, a handful of engineers in the United States and Europe were tinkering with increasingly advanced computation devices. Konrad Zuse in Germany built the Z series of machines, using electromechanical relays to perform binary calculations. Zuse's story is often overshadowed by events of World War II, but his work was pioneering. He dreamed of fully functional universal computing machines, designing some of the earliest high-level programming concepts. Meanwhile, at Harvard University in the United States, Howard Aiken collaborated with IBM to create the Harvard Mark I CR, also known as the IBM Automatic Sequence Controlled Calculator, or ASCC. Completed in 1944, the Mark I was a 50-foot-long electromechanical computer that used miles of wiring and thousands of relays. It performed calculations reliably but slowly by modern standards. Each operation took fractions of a second, which seemed fast at the time, yet painstakingly slow when measured against post-war electronic machines. There's a charming anecdote about the Harvard Mark 1 and a literal bug. One day the machine malfunctioned. Grace Hopper, a pioneering computer programmer who worked on the Mark 1, recorded finding a moth trapped in a relay. She taped it into the project's logbook, humorously noting it as the first actual case of bug being found. Thus, the term debugging took on new life. Though the phrase had been used in engineering contexts before, this incident popularized it in the world of computing. Alan Turing, the mind behind the machine. No discussion of early computing is complete without Alan Matheson Turing, a brilliant English mathematician who quietly transformed the world. Before war erupted in Europe, Turing published his 1936 paper on computable numbers, describing an abstract machine, now known as the Turing machine, that could, given enough time and tape, solve any problem that could be described algorithmically. The Turing machine concept became the theoretical cornerstone for computer science, defining the limits of what is computable. When World War II broke out, Turing was recruited to Bletchley Park, the British code-breaking centre. The Germans' Enigma machine was thought to produce unbreakable ciphers, but Turing's ingenuity, combined with the efforts of a brilliant team of cryptanalysts, led to the development of electromechanical code-breaking devices called bombs. These machines systematically tested Enigma rotor settings, drastically narrowing the possibilities until human codebreakers could decipher the messages. Turing also designed the automatic computing engine ACE concept, a blueprint for an electronic stored program computer that, while not built in its initial form during the war, influenced subsequent designs. The hush-hush nature of wartime research meant Turing's breakthroughs remained largely secret until decades later. Yet in those confidential labs, the bedrock for modern computing was being laid. Colossus, the first programmable electronic computer. While Turing's bombs were mostly electromechanical, a separate team at Bletchley Park, led by Tommy Flowers, developed the Colossus machines, often cited as the world's first programmable electronic computers. Colossus employed over 2,000 vacuum tubes to decipher German teleprinter ciphers. This was not a general-purpose machine in the sense we define today, but it could be reprogrammed with patch cables and switches to handle different cryptanalytic tasks. The secrecy surrounding Colossus was immense. The British government feared revealing its existence might compromise future intelligence operations. After the war, the Colossi were destroyed or locked away, stalling public knowledge and overshadowing the significance of the effort. As a result, public recognition for the first electronic computer often fell to the American-built ENIAC, but in historical hindsight, Colossus was a vital milestone. The war's aftermath, a new world order. World War II accelerated computing technology at breakneck speed. Militaries and governments, desperate for an edge, poured resources into projects that shrank theoretical timelines from decades to mere years. Alan Turing left the war as a hero in the shadows, his country benefiting from his genius, but ultimately giving him too little recognition and tragically persecuting him for his homosexuality later in life. At the same time, the seeds of post-war computer science sprouted globally. Future projects would translate war-tested technologies into peacetime applications, calculating artillery trajectories, automating accounting tasks, and eventually guiding rockets into space. The impetus of war gave birth to an era of electronics that would soon overshadow the mechanical contraptions of yesteryear. In the offices of governments and corporations, visionaries like John von Neumann in the US and Max Newman in Britain mulled over the next steps. What if a machine could store not only data, but the instructions that told it how to manipulate that data? Could we build a universal machine with limitless reconfigurability? For the moment, the war-weary world exhaled. So many had fought, so many had died, and entire continents had been scarred. Yet out of this global conflict came a new impetus for peaceful progress, computers that could help humanity build instead of destroy, to innovate instead of annihilate. It was time for the purely electronic computers to step forward, powered by vacuum tubes, fueled by the newly articulated desire to push the boundaries of possibility. And so, as peace tentatively descended across the rubble-strewn cities, a new arms race would begin, this time in the labs and universities that yearned to build the future. Part 3. The vacuum tube era and the dawn of electronic computing, 1940s, mid-1950s. Once the dust of World War II settled, the stage was set for the rise of fully electronic computers. People had glimpsed what computing machines could do when properly funded and directed. Now, a peacetime shift would take place. Academic institutions, government agencies, and businesses began pouring their attention into building machines that were bigger, faster, and more versatile. ENIAC, the public star. In the United States, ENIAC, Electronic Numerical Integrator and Computer, had the spotlight. Built at the University of Pennsylvania's Moore School of Electrical Engineering, ENIAC was unveiled to the public in 1946. It contained nearly 18,000 vacuum tubes, 70,000 resistors, and 5 million hand-soldered joints, occupying a space the size of a large room. The machine was designed to calculate artillery firing tables for the US Army, but could be repurposed for a variety of numerical tasks. The unveiling of ENIAC to the press was almost theatrical. Journalists marveled at its wall-sized panels of blinking lights, spinning dials, and miles of tangled wiring. Demonstrations showed how ENIAC could compute in seconds what would have taken a team of human computers weeks. Although temperamental, vacuum tubes burned out regularly, necessitating near-constant maintenance. ENIAC signaled a new epoch. A little-known anecdote: the first programmers for ENIAC were 6 women: Kay McNulty, Frances Bylas, Betty Jennings, Betty Snyder, Marlin Westcoff, and Ruth Lichterman, who were hired to set up the calculations. Because the architecture had no stored program, programming entailed physically rerouting cables and setting switches. They had to interpret complex mathematical equations and translate them into wiring diagrams. Their contributions were largely unheralded until many years later, when historians finally recognized their pivotal role. The von Neumann architecture. While ENIAC was a sensation, John von Neumann was already theorizing improvements. In 1945, he authored a crucial document, the first draft of a report on the IDVC, that laid out the concept of the stored program computer, often called the von Neumann architecture. The idea: a computer's memory would contain not just data, but also the instructions on how to process that data. The control unit would fetch these instructions sequentially, interpret them, and execute them. This remains the basis of nearly all modern computers. The earliest machine to successfully implement these ideas was arguably the Manchester Baby, built in 1948 at the University of Manchester. This small-scale experimental computer proved the feasibility of storing programs in electronic memory. Not long after, the EDCS, Electronic Delay Storage Automatic Calculator, at the University of Cambridge, and the EDVAC, Electronic Discrete Variable Automatic Computer, in the US, both ran stored programs. These machines were smaller and more specialized than ENIAC, but they were conceptually more advanced. Around this time, Alan Turing also returned from Bletchley Park to the National Physical Laboratory, NPL, to work on his own design called the Automatic Computing Engine, ACE. Bureaucracy and funding obstacles slowed Turing's progress, enabling other projects to leap ahead. Nevertheless, Turing's design introduced groundbreaking ideas about subroutines, memory optimization, and programming languages. Battling the heat. Vacuum tubes' Achilles heel. Though vacuum tubes enabled electronic computing, they were notoriously unreliable and power-hungry. A typical vacuum tube computer might use thousands or tens of thousands of tubes, each generating heat and prone to burning out. Rooms required powerful air conditioning to prevent meltdown. A single burnt-out tube could crash the entire machine, leading to frequent downtime. Yet for all these drawbacks, vacuum tubes unlocked computing speeds unimaginable in the days of mechanical relays. Operations could happen thousands of times faster, unleashing computational feats that changed the landscape of science. From modeling nuclear physics to cracking advanced math problems, these early electronic computers became the new scientific heavyweights. UNIVAC, the commercial breakthrough. While universities and government labs pushed the envelope of what computers could do, business interests perked up at the possibility of automated data processing. The punch-card systems of IBM were dependable for tasks like accounting and census work, but the promise of an electronic solution was enticing. In 1951, UNIVAC-1, Universal Automatic Computer, made its grand debut. Created by J. Presper Eckert and John Markley, the same duo behind ENIAC, UNIVAC was the first commercially produced electronic computer in the United States. Its most famous moment came during the 1952 U.S. presidential election. CBS used a UNIVAC to predict a landslide win for Dwight D. Eisenhower over Adlai Stevenson. Despite the computer's accurate early prediction, the network doubted it and initially withheld the result on air. When the final results aligned with UNIVAC's forecast, public fascination soared. It said that an IBM salesman, upon hearing the buzz about UNIVAC's prediction, quipped that Big Blue wasn't in the fortune-telling business yet. Within a few years, IBM would indeed pivot aggressively into the electronic computing realm, selling mainframes that dwarfed UNIVAC's market share. A whiff of the future, high-level languages. In the vacuum tube era, programming was typically done in machine code, strings of binary or octal instructions, or assembly language, mnemonics for machine instructions. This was a daunting barrier, confining programming to a specialized priesthood of mathematicians and engineers. However, the seeds of higher-level languages were already sprouting. In 1954, John ABACUS at IBM began developing Fortran, formula translation, a language designed for scientific and engineering calculations. While not widely adopted until a few years later, Fortran proved that you could write programs in something resembling algebraic notation, which the computer would then compile into machine code. This revolutionized software development, heralding a future where coding might be more about conceptual problem-solving than toggling switches on a control panel. Around the same time, Grace Hopper, who had worked on the Harvard Mark I, was pioneering the concept of a compiler. In 1952, she developed the A0 system, considered one of the first compilers, which could translate higher-level instructions into machine code. Hopper later led the creation of COBOL, Common Business-Oriented Language, which would become the backbone of much commercial data processing, and is still used in some financial institutions today. Though these developments would fully bloom in the transistor era, the ideas were already out in the open. The mania of vacuum tube computing was laying a robust foundation. The transition looms. By the mid-1950s, it was evident that vacuum tubes, for all their successes, were not the ultimate solution. Engineers dreamt of smaller, more reliable components. Laboratories started experimenting with the transistor, invented at Bell Labs in 1947 by John Bardeen, Walter Brattain, and William Shockley. At first, transistors were expensive and tricky to manufacture at scale. But the potential was dazzling. A transistor-based computer could be smaller, more efficient, and far more reliable. The shift from tubes to transistors would mark a leap as significant as the jump from mechanical relays to tubes. Soon, entire rooms filled with vacuum tube computers would be overshadowed by machines that were faster, cheaper, and cooler, both thermally and metaphorically. Yet the vacuum tube era was essential. It established the viability of fully electronic computing, created a generation of programmers, and sparked the commercial computer industry. It introduced the mass public to the idea that machines could assist, perhaps even outsmart, human thought. Long after the last vacuum tube flickered out, the legacy of this era would remain in the knowledge gained, the programming techniques refined, and the grand vision it fostered. In the next act, transistors would shrink the scale of machines and expand the scale of possibility, leading to a new wave of innovation that would set the stage for personal computing, the Internet, and beyond. Part 4. The Transistor Revolution. Smaller, faster, more reliable. Mid-1950s, 1960s. By the mid-1950s, the transistor was poised to transform computing. The vacuum tube had proven that fully electronic calculation was possible, but its inherent flaws, heat, size, fragility, limited its future. Enter the transistor, a semiconductor device that could amplify or switch electronic signals without the headaches of glass enclosures and burning filaments. This single innovation would birth the second generation of computers. Bell Labs and the birth of the transistor. The story begins at Bell Telephone Laboratories, Bell Labs, where in 1947 three researchers, John Bardeen, Walter Brattain, and William Shockley, unveiled the first transistor. They used germanium crystals to fabricate a small device that replaced bulky vacuum tubes in certain applications. At the time, Bell Labs' primary interest was improving telephone systems. Yet it didn't take long for others to realize the transistor's potential for computing. Transistors consumed far less power, produced minimal heat, and were orders of magnitude smaller than vacuum tubes. Although early transistors were delicate and difficult to manufacture, the path forward was clear. Miniaturization was the future. Transistor computers, a quiet revolution. The transition to transistor-based computers wasn't instantaneous. Manufacturers had to retool assembly lines and engineers had to redesign circuits. The first commercial transistor computer is often cited as the Metropolitan Vickers MV 950 in the UK, circa 1956. But transistor adoption ramped up more dramatically in the early 1960s. IBM released transistorized models like the IBM 1401 and later the IBM 7090. These machines were faster and more dependable than their vacuum tube predecessors. They also occupied less space. Businesses that once balked at the monstrous ENIACs of old began to see computers as practical investments. A typical day in a 1960s corporate data center might feature a transistorized mainframe humming away in a temperature-controlled room. Nearby, operators in white shirts and ties, or occasionally lab coats, fed punch cards into a reader. The line printer rattled off reams of green-striped paper. A job might be run overnight, with the results delivered the next morning. Although archaic by today's standards, this was a quantum leap forward from the tube-laden colossi of a decade earlier. Software blossoms, COBOL and Fortran dominate. As hardware advanced, so did software. Fortran, established by John Backus and team at IBM, became the de facto language for scientific and engineering tasks. Meanwhile, COBOL, developed by a committee that included Grace Hopper, gained traction in business data processing. COBOL's English-like syntax was intended to make programs more readable to non-technical managers, though true mastery still required specialized knowledge. In a short anecdote from a 1960s bank, a manager skeptical of these new electronic brains insisted on reviewing COBOL code. He found lines like CS, copy code, add wages to total pay display, payroll complete. He was astonished how close it looked to plain English. Even if he couldn't fully decipher the structure, it felt more approachable than cryptic binary or assembly instructions. This small revelation helped ease business executives' fears about adopting computer systems, fueling deeper investments. The integrated circuit emerges. Transistors alone were transformative, but the 1960s brought another leap: integrated circuits, ICs. Instead of having discrete transistors, resistors and capacitors soldered individually onto a board, engineers like Jack Kilby at Texas Instruments and Robert Noyce at Fairchild Semiconductor pioneered techniques to fabricate multiple electronic components on a single piece of semiconductor material, usually silicon. The first integrated circuits were modest, containing just a handful of transistors, but they hinted at an exponential growth trajectory. Instead of building circuits by hand, engineers could create large-scale patterns on silicon wafers, slicing them into chips. Reliability soared, size shrank, and speeds increased. Though the earliest IC-based computers were still called second generation, they foreshadowed the third generation of computing that was about to dawn. Space race and computer innovation. Computers also found themselves at the heart of the 1960s space race. In the United States, NASA poured resources into guidance systems, control modules, and telemetry computers. The Apollo Guidance Computer, AGC, designed by MIT engineers, used integrated circuits to keep weight and power consumption low enough for the spacecraft. Imagine the tension at NASA's mission control. Rows of large consoles manned by engineers tracking the flight path of a Saturn V rocket. Data from the AGC streamed down as blinking lights and numeric readouts. When Apollo 11 approached the Moon in July 1969, the AGC famously triggered multiple alarm codes due to processor overload. Engineers quickly deduced that the system was shedding non-essential tasks to focus on landing. Despite the alarms, the AGC performed flawlessly where it mattered, helping Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin become the first humans to set foot on another celestial body. Beyond NASA, Cold War pressures drove miniaturization in military computer systems, from ballistic missile guidance to spy satellites. Governments funded research into smaller, faster hardware that could fit into submarines, aircraft, and ground vehicles. This enormous flow of capital into R&D advanced the entire field, inadvertently paving the way for consumer electronics down the line. The growing presence of IBM. By the 1960s, IBM had emerged as a dominant force in the computer industry. Its product line, such as the System 360, introduced in 1964, exemplified the shift towards standardized architectures. Prior machines were often one-off designs that needed unique peripherals and software. The System 360 series offered a family of compatible machines, meaning a business could upgrade from a smaller model to a larger model without completely rewriting software. This was revolutionary for the industry. Companies no longer had to fear that their programs would become obsolete if they bought a new computer. IBM's marketing might was vast, and the System 360 soon became the standard platform for much of the corporate world. The term IBM and the Seven Dwarfs was coined to describe IBM's market dominance compared to smaller competitors like Sperry Rand, Univac, Burroughs, and NCR. Mini-computers rise. While mainframes ruled large corporations and government labs, a parallel trend was emerging: the mini-computer. Companies like Digital Equipment Corporation, DC, challenged the idea that all computing had to be large and expensive. In 1965, DC released the PDP-8, priced around $18,000, far cheaper than a mainframe. Universities, research labs, and smaller businesses suddenly found computing accessible. The PDP-8 was a fraction of the size of a typical mainframe, often fitting into a few refrigerator-sized racks. For the first time, departments or labs could have their own computer without going through a central data center. This democratization seeded a new generation of programmers and sparked creativity in software development. A famous story: a small engineering firm purchased a PDP-8 to automate its design calculations. An enthusiastic engineer, curious about what else the machine could do, stayed after hours to write a program that generated music from the PDP-8's console speaker. The bleeps and bloops that echoed down the hallway at midnight represented the unstoppable march toward personal expression through computing, something unthinkable with the exclusive corporate-owned mainframes of just a few years prior. The stage is set for the next generation. By the close of the 1960s, computing technology had advanced light years from the vacuum tube era. Transistor-based machines were faster, smaller, and more reliable. Integrated circuits were gaining momentum, hinting at an even more compact future. Software was maturing with established high-level languages, and new business models made computers more accessible. Meanwhile, the seeds of advanced research on computer networks, time-sharing systems, and graphical interfaces were quietly germinating in places like DARPA and Xerox PARC. As we turn the page to the 1970s, a perfect storm of technological convergence, ICEs, cheaper manufacturing, and user-focused software would ignite the next revolution: the microprocessor and the birth of personal computers. And so, the transistor era ended not in a whimper, but in a triumphant crescendo, having set the foundations for everything that followed. Humanity was on the brink of putting computational power into individuals' hands, turning what was once a room-sized, corporate, or governmental behemoth into something that could sit on a desk, or even be held in one's palm. Part 5. The Microprocessor. Revolution and the Dawn of Personal Computing, 1970s, early 1980s. By the early 1970s, computers no longer exclusively dwelled in sprawling corporate basements or government labs. Transistors and integrated circuits had already chipped away at the massive size and power requirements of earlier generations. But the next leap, one that would utterly transform society, came in the form of a tiny chip that could do the job of an entire CPU board, the microprocessor. The Intel 4004 and the spark of change. In 1971, a small team at Intel, including Ted Hoff, Federico Fagin, and Stanley Maser, unveiled the Intel 4004, the world's first commercially available microprocessor. Just a few millimeters across, the 4004 integrated thousands of transistors that could execute instructions on a single chip. It was initially developed for a Japanese calculator manufacturer, but it became a proof of concept that entire central processing units could exist as self-contained chips. The Intel 4004 ignited excitement in tech circles, albeit quietly at first. Hobbyists and electronics enthusiasts marveled at the possibility that they could build a computer themselves without needing a forklift. Legend has it that soon after the 4004's release, a group of Intel engineers gathered in a small break room, excitedly debating whether microprocessors might someday find their way into household products, microwaves, washing machines, even thermostats. A few skeptics laughed. The cost still seemed prohibitive for consumer goods, but the seeds of a ubiquitous computing future were already planted. Intel quickly followed up with the 8008 and then the 8080 in 1974, which significantly upped the performance. By mid-decade, competitors like Motorola with the 6800 and MOS Technology with the 6502 jumped into the fray. A new industry, personal microcomputers, was forming almost overnight. Altair 8800, build it yourself, computing. In 1975, a small company called MITS, Micro-Instrumentation and Telemetry Systems, released the Altair 8800 as a kit for hobbyists. It used the Intel 8080 processor and came in a metal box with a front panel full of switches and blinking lights, reminiscent of something from a science fiction movie. Buyers received a thick manual detailing how to assemble the machine. The cost was around $400 for the kit, a fraction of big computers, but still pricey for the average consumer. The Altair 8800 graced the cover of the January 1975 issue of Popular Electronics, capturing the imagination of tinkerers nationwide. Young people in garages tried to interface the Altair with teletype machines or rudimentary monitors, painstakingly flipping switches to enter instructions. One anecdote has a father and teenage daughter working late nights in their basement to get the Altair to do simple arithmetic. When the lights flashed the correct result, they let out a cheer loud enough to wake the neighbors. The Altair's release sparked an ecosystem of knockoffs, clones, and expansions. It also inspired two Harvard dropouts, Bill Gates and Paul Allen, to write a basic interpreter for the Altair, which they licensed through their fledgling company, Microsoft. This moment is often cited as the birth of the personal computing software industry. Homebrew Computer Club, a hotbed of ideas. In the mid-1970s, the Homebrew Computer Club in Silicon Valley became a nexus for enthusiasts who believed in the transformative power of personal computing. They met in garages, academic rooms, or even living rooms, sharing circuit diagrams and lines of assembly code. Each success, a blinking LED here, a working memory expansion there, was celebrated like a grand triumph. It's said that during one homebrew meeting, a young electronics wizard named Steve Wozniak showed off a design that displayed characters on a screen. Wozniak's friend, Steve Jobs, immediately saw commercial potential. While Woz refined the technology, Jobs figured out how to market it. Their partnership would soon produce one of the most iconic personal computers in history, the Apple I. Apple's early triumphs, from Apple I to Apple II. In 1976, Apple Computer Company, founded by Jobs, Wozniak, and Ronald Wayne, introduced the Apple I. It was essentially a bare circuit board. Buyers still had to supply their own keyboard and monitor, often an old TV. Wozniak's genius lay in clever circuit design. He squeezed maximum functionality out of minimal chips, helping keep costs down. The Apple I had modest success among enthusiasts, but what came next was a blockbuster. Launched in 1977, the Apple II sported a sleek plastic case, integrated keyboard, color graphics, and a high-level language, integer basic, built into ROM. It was among the first plug-and-play microcomputers that didn't demand advanced electronics knowledge. The Apple II turned heads with its ability to run games like Breakout or Lemonade Stand and business programs like VisiCalc, the first spreadsheet software, which single-handedly propelled the Apple II into many corporate offices. A legendary story. A small bakery chain adopted VisiCalc on an Apple II to balance its books and track orders. The CFO, initially hesitant about this silly hobby machine, was won over when monthly accounting tasks shrank from weeks to days. Word spread, and soon Apple II computers multiplied in small businesses nationwide. An early sign that personal computers weren't just for hobbyists. Commodore, Tandy, and the 1977 Trinity. Apple wasn't alone. The year 1977 became known as the Trinity of personal computing, referring to the release of three major systems: Apple II, Commodore PET, Tandy TRS-80 from Radio Shack. The Commodore PET, Personal Electronic Transactor, was an all-in-one machine with an integrated monitor, keyboard, and cassette deck. It garnered a loyal following in schools and small businesses. The Tandy TRS-80 was sold in Radio Shack stores. Shoppers who walked in to buy a radio or hobby kit stumbled upon a fully assembled computer for under $600, though the price soared once you added memory and peripherals. For many, the TRS-80 was the first machine they'd ever seen in person that could programmatically display text on a screen. This trio of machines made personal computing mainstream enough that newspapers ran features on local computer buffs, and schools began lobbying for funds to equip classrooms. A culture shift was underway. Computing was no longer a domain guarded by punch cards, mainframes, and specialized technicians. Anyone with some savings and curiosity could own a slice of the future. IBM enters the scene. Amid the personal computer gold rush, IBM, the colossus of mainframes, watched warily. Executives at Big Blue initially dismissed microcomputers as toys until they realized that Apple, Commodore, and a host of upstart companies were nibbling away at potential markets. Businesses were also beginning to ask why they couldn't just use Apple IIs or Commodores for smaller departmental tasks. By 1980, IBM decided to build its own personal computer, and quickly. A small, semi-autonomous group in Boca Raton, Florida, took up the challenge, selecting off-the-shelf components to expedite development. They chose Intel's 8088 processor and an operating system licensed from Microsoft, MS-DOS. In a bold departure from IBM tradition, they made the system's architecture relatively open, meaning third parties could create compatible hardware and software. The IBM PC launched in August 1981. It was modest compared to some competitor machines, initially only 16 KB of RAM, no graphics, and a monochrome display by default, but it carried the IBM brand. An oft-repeated anecdote has an IBM salesman revealing the new PC at a trade show booth, where curious suits lined up to see the machine run a spreadsheet or word processor. One executive was overheard saying, "It doesn't do much more than the Apple, but it's from IBM." That stamp of corporate approval would reshape the industry. Microsoft and DOS, the software powerhouse. While the hardware market became crowded, Microsoft found itself holding a golden ticket. The story goes, when IBM approached Microsoft for an operating system, Bill Gates and team didn't have one ready-made. They purchased the rights to QDOS, Quick and Dirty Operating System, from Seattle Computer Products, refined it, and rebranded it as MS-DOS, Microsoft Disk Operating System. IBM licensed it as PC-DOS, but Microsoft retained rights to sell MS-DOS separately. This licensing arrangement changed the landscape. Clones of the IBM PC, commonly called IBM compatibles, flooded the market. Each one needed DOS or a DOS-like system, ensuring that Microsoft software became ubiquitous. Microsoft soared from a scrappy startup to a titan, paving the way for the later success of Microsoft Windows, clones, compatibles, and the widening market. IBM's open architecture inadvertently launched a booming clone industry. Compaq, Dell, and a host of smaller companies built PCs around Intel chips and Microsoft software. Over time, these compatibles eroded IBM's dominance in hardware sales, forcing Big Blue to compete on an even playing field. For consumers and businesses, this meant lower prices and a proliferation of choices. It also fostered a standard platform that software developers could reliably target. Word processors, spreadsheets, and databases sprouted for DOS systems, forming the backbone of office computing in the 1980s. Enthusiasts coded homebrew games or system utilities in their bedrooms, distributing them via bulletin board systems, BBS, or on floppy disks at local computer clubs. The Apple-IBM divide. While the IBM PC and its clones conquered the business world, Apple carved a distinct path. In 1980, Apple went public, making millionaires of many early employees. The Apple II line sold steadily, especially with its color graphics and huge library of games and educational software. Yet behind the scenes, Steve Jobs was restless. He wanted something revolutionary. By 1982-83, Apple was investing heavily in projects like the Lisa and the soon-to-be Macintosh, each with a graphical user interface, GUI, inspired by research at Xerox PARC. These systems were bold but expensive, and Apple found itself competing not just on hardware, but on ideas. Friendly, visually oriented computing versus the command-line approach of DOS. Although the GUI future was just around the corner, business customers in the early 1980s mostly stuck with cheaper IBM DOS machines. Home computers proliferate. Meanwhile, the personal computing market expanded beyond businesses into family living rooms. Following the pioneering Apple II, machines like the Commodore VIC-20, Commodore 64, Atari 800, ZX Spectrum, and Amstrad CPC brought simple programming and gaming to millions of households. Children learned BASIC by typing in code from magazines, and an entire generation grew up with computers as a familiar presence. A typical suburban evening circa 1983 might involve a child hooking up a Commodore 64 to the family TV, typing load 8.1 to run a game on a floppy disk or cassette. Parents marveled that the same machine could also help with homework or household budgeting. At times, loading software from cassette tapes took agonizing minutes, accompanied by screeching sounds and flickering status screens. Yet the sense of possibility was boundless. The cultural shift. By the early 1980s, personal computers had made the leap from niche curiosity to cultural phenomenon. News shows ran segments on how personal computers might reshape education. Hollywood films like War Games 1983 depicted teens hacking into military systems using a home PC, fueling both excitement and anxiety about the power of this new technology. Magazines featured covers proclaiming the computer age, while families debated the value of buying a computer for the house. Was it really an educational tool, or just an expensive toy? Universities also adapted, offering more courses in computer science, software development, and digital engineering. A joke circulated among students in 1983 that CS stands for can't sleep, referencing the all-night coding sessions required to keep up with the fast-evolving field. The dot matrix printer's incessant chattering in dorm rooms became the soundtrack of a generation chasing newly minted programming dreams. On the threshold of a new era, the microprocessor revolution, fueled by Intel, Motorola, MOS technology, and others, had put powerful computation in the hands of the everyday consumer. Dozens of competing platforms vied for attention, but two major forces, IBM-compatible PCs on one side and Apple on the other, were drawing the battle lines that would dominate the next decade. Meanwhile, under the surface, a new wave of innovation was brewing. At research labs like Xerox PARC, scientists were tinkering with local area networks, Ethernet, object-oriented programming, and the very concept of a computer mouse as a pointing device for on-screen navigation. These ideas hinted that computing's next frontier would involve graphical desktops, icons and windows, far beyond the blinking command lines of DOS or BASIC. And so, the personal computer era was in full swing, igniting imaginations around the world. From the swirl of innovation, competition, and youthful enthusiasm emerged a simple, powerful truth. Computers were no longer confined to specialized experts. They now belonged to everyone. The seeds planted in the 1970s would soon flourish into a universal phenomenon, with the upcoming wave of graphical interfaces, networking, and the eventual birth of the Internet. But that is a story for Part 6, where we'll step into the 1980s and 1990s to explore the GUI revolution, the triumph of the IBM-compatible ecosystem, Apple's uphill battle, and the dawning of global computer networks that would soon unite humanity in ways previously thought impossible. Part 6. The GUI Revolution and the Battle for the Desktop, mid-1980s, early 1990s. By the mid-1980s, personal computing had taken hold in homes, schools, and businesses. Users were growing more comfortable with clacking keys on a DOS or BASIC prompt, but many found command lines intimidating. Meanwhile, in research labs and forward-thinking companies, a new paradigm was brewing. The graphical user interface, GUI, complete with windows, icons, and a device called a mouse for intuitive navigation. Xerox PARC, the hidden innovator. Any history of the GUI must pay homage to Xerox PARC, Palo Alto Research Center, where many revolutionary ideas first took shape in the 1970s. Researchers there experimented with a personal workstation called the Alto, featuring a bitmap display, a mouse, and icons representing files and folders. The Alto wasn't sold commercially, but it showed that computers could be more than text-based. They could be visual, user-friendly, and networked via Ethernet. A well-known story has a young Steve Jobs touring Xerox PARC in 1979. Stunned by the Alto's interface, he realized that such visual interaction could be the next big thing. According to one anecdote, Jobs practically jumped out of his seat, peppering the Xerox engineers with questions. "Why aren't you commercializing this?" he reportedly asked. "This is revolutionary." In time, Apple took the GUI concept mainstream, but not without major stumbles along the way. Apple's Lisa and Macintosh. Apple's first attempt at a commercial GUI machine was the Lisa, launched in 1983. Though innovative, it had a mouse, pull-down menus, and a desktop metaphor. The Lisa was prohibitively expensive, nearly $10,000. Its marketing fell flat, and sales languished. Enter the Macintosh, revealed by Steve Jobs in January 1984, with a now legendary Super Bowl commercial directed by Ridley Scott. Priced at $2,495, still steep by many standards, the Mac was more affordable than the Lisa, though still no bargain. It featured a 9-inch black-and-white display, a single-button mouse, and built-in software like MacPaint and MacWrite. Despite limitations, only 128 KB of RAM at launch, the Mac's GUI charmed early adopters. Anecdote. On the day of the Mac's unveiling, Apple employees lined the stage, cheering as Jobs pulled the machine from its bag. The Mac's voice synthesis greeted the audience with a polite, "Hello," drawing gasps and applause. Though critics complained about its meager memory and single floppy drive, the Mac introduced the mass market to GUIs. Apple's slogan proclaimed it was, "The computer for the rest of us." Microsoft Windows, following the GUI footsteps. While Apple focused on the Mac, Microsoft, riding high from MS-DOS dominance on IBM PCs, recognized that GUIs might threaten its command line empire if it failed to adapt. Bill Gates announced Microsoft Windows in 1983. However, Windows 1.0, released in 1985, and Windows 2.0, 1987, were underwhelming, offering clunky Windows on top of DOS. Many applications still ran best in text mode. Microsoft persisted, forging deals with PC manufacturers to bundle Windows, ensuring it was pre-installed on new machines. By 1990, Windows 3.0 arrived with improved performance and a more polished interface. Retailers stocked rows of gleaming 3.5-inch floppy boxes, and the business world tentatively embraced Windows for its relative ease of use. Spreadsheets, word processors, and databases now had consistent menus and icons, quickly overshadowing DOS-based software. One telling anecdote: a sales rep demoed Windows 3.0 to a skeptical office manager, resizing overlapping windows and using drop-down menus with a mouse. The manager exclaimed, "It's like having a desk with papers you can shuffle around." This simple visual metaphor converts faster than any tech specs could. Desktop wars, Apple versus Microsoft. Throughout the late 1980s, Apple and Microsoft jousted for GUI supremacy. Apple had sued Microsoft in 1988, alleging that Windows infringed on Mac's look and feel. After years of legal wrangling, Microsoft largely prevailed. The ruling reinforced the notion that GUIs were now an industry standard. Meanwhile, Apple's market share fluctuated, buoyed by a loyal fanbase, but threatened by the ever-cheaper clones in the PC world. Among tech enthusiasts, arguments raged. Which was better, Mac or PC? Loyalists jeered each other on bulletin board systems and in computer clubs. Apple fans touted the Mac's polished UI and stable hardware-software integration, while PC advocates prized flexibility, lower cost, and a vast software library. This rivalry shaped the computing landscape for decades. Rise of desktop publishing. A surprise killer app for the Mac was desktop publishing. Programs like Aldus PageMaker, later Adobe PageMaker, and Apple's partnership with Adobe on PostScript printing turned the Mac into a tool beloved by graphic designers and publishers. Suddenly, a small office or even a freelancer could produce professional-looking newsletters, brochures and books without expensive typesetting equipment. The phenomenon fueled Apple's survival during times when IBM-compatible PCs were dominating most business markets. An amusing anecdote: a tiny local newspaper replaced its old paste-up boards and hot wax machines with a single Mac, a PageMaker license, and a laser printer. The editor joked, "Now I can do in one afternoon what used to take 3 people all night and with fewer paper cuts." Networks and Novell. While GUIs changed how users interacted with machines, another quiet revolution was linking these machines together. Local area networks, LANs, took off in the 1980s. Novell NetWare emerged as a premier network operating system, allowing PCs to share files and printers. Corporate offices installed coaxial or twisted pair cabling, hooking up dozens of PCs to a central file server. Suddenly, teams could collaborate in near real time, a massive leap from sneakernet days of physically carrying floppy disks between machines. Unix and workstations. Meanwhile, in the domain of research and high-end engineering, Unix-based workstations from Sun Microsystems, Silicon Graphics, SGI, and HP offered powerful graphical desktops for CAD, computer-aided design, 3D modeling, and scientific computing. Systems like Sun's Spark Stations or SGI's Iris had advanced graphics, fueling breakthroughs in Hollywood CGI and complex scientific simulations. These machines were priced out of reach for most consumers, but showcased the upper limits of GUIs and networked multitasking. The stage is set for the Internet. By the early 1990s, personal computers, whether Mac or PC, were generally sold with a mouse and a GUI-based OS. High-end Unix workstations thrived in labs and studios. Networks were everywhere, from small office LANs to the wide-area networks connecting universities. Yet a new phenomenon was about to go mainstream: the Internet. While it had existed in academic and military circles for years, soon the common user would encounter email, FTP, and then the World Wide Web, sending the computing world into warp speed. So, as the GUI revolution solidified, computing felt more familiar and user-friendly. The next big wave, network connectivity on a global scale, was about to capture the world's attention, forever changing how humans communicate, shop, learn, and entertain themselves. The fuse was lit for Part 7, where we'll dive headlong into the Internet's explosive emergence, from humble text-based protocols to the mosaic of web browsers that catapulted cyberspace into the public consciousness. Part 7. The Internet Boom and the World Wide Web. Early 1990s, early 2000s. While GUIs revolutionized local computing in the 1980s, an even larger shift was quietly underway, connecting computers globally via the Internet. Initially an academic and governmental network, the Internet would burst into mainstream culture in the 1990s, fundamentally altering how society communicates and does business. ARPANET to the global Internet. The Internet traces its ancestry to ARPANET, funded by the U.S. Department of Defense's Advanced Research Projects Agency, ARPA, in the late 1960s. ARPANET linked research universities for data sharing, using the pioneering packet switching concept. Over time, multiple networks joined, adopting protocols like TCP/IP, Transmission Control Protocol, Internet Protocol, championed by Vint Cerf and Bob Kahn in the 1970s. By the 1980s, NSFNet, National Science Foundation Network, expanded academic Internet connectivity across the US, eventually linking to networks in Europe and Asia. Yet the Internet largely remained a text-based domain for scientists, academics, and military users. Email, Usenet newsgroups, and FTP were common, but the average home user likely hadn't heard of them. Tim Berners-Lee and the World Wide Web. All this changed in 1989, when a British scientist named Tim Berners-Lee, working at CERN, the European Physics Lab, proposed a system for linking documents via hypertext. He called it the World Wide Web. By 1991, he had created the first web server, info.cern.gh, and the first web browser, Editor. With the HTTP protocol and HTML documents, Berners-Lee made it easy for anyone to create and link pages that could be navigated by clicking hyperlinks. An oft-told anecdote says that many of Berners-Lee's colleagues barely grasped the significance of his invention at first, but soon more and more people at CERN started creating simple web pages, and the idea took off. The web was free to use without licensing fees, fueling its explosive growth once more browsers appeared. Mosaic and the browser revolution. In 1993, a group at the University of Illinois' National Center for Supercomputing Applications, NCSA, released Mosaic, the first widely popular graphical web browser. Mosaic made the web visually accessible, inline images, clickable text, and a user-friendly interface. Almost overnight, web traffic soared. Suddenly, surfing the net became a common phrase. One story recounts how a college freshman in 1993 discovered Mosaic on a campus workstation. Fascinated, he spent the entire night clicking through sites, NASA images, academic papers, early personal pages on GeoCities. By dawn, he was convinced the web was the future. That freshman later joined a startup that specialized in web technologies, mirroring the countless entrepreneurial leaps inspired by Mosaic's arrival. Netscape Navigator and the dot-com frenzy. Members of the Mosaic team founded Netscape in 1994, releasing Netscape Navigator soon after. For many, Navigator became synonymous with the web itself, fast, feature-rich, and free for non-commercial use. By 1995, browsing websites, sending emails, and chatting in early forums had become everyday activities for millions. The media heralded a cyberspace revolution, and investors smelled opportunity. The mid to late 1990s saw a dot-com gold rush. Startups with .com in their names attracted skyrocketing valuations, even if their business models were hazy. Venture capital poured into e-commerce, online advertising, and web services. Internet service providers, ISPs like AOL, CompuServe, and Earthlink vied for dial-up subscribers, mailing out endless CDs promising free trial hours. Households endured the screeching handshake of a 56K modem to explore the growing web. Chat rooms, email, online forums, and quirky personal websites on platforms like Angelfire and Tripod. A comedic anecdote. One ISP reportedly mailed so many AOL CDs that a group of college students used them to tile a bathroom wall. Another homeowner fashioned them into a shimmering wind chime. The joke was that America Online was single-handedly driving the optical media manufacturing industry. Microsoft enters the browser wars. Realizing the web could challenge its desktop dominance, Microsoft pivoted quickly. In 1995, it launched Internet Explorer, initially based on Mosaic code licensed from Spyglass. Bundled free with Windows 95 and subsequent versions, IE soon grabbed a large share of the market. The browser wars ignited. Netscape Navigator versus Internet Explorer. At first, Netscape seemed unassailable, but Microsoft's deep pockets and Windows integration gave IE a major advantage. By the early 2000s, Navigator's market share had dwindled, culminating in Netscape's eventual demise. Meanwhile, Microsoft faced antitrust scrutiny for monopolistic tactics, namely bundling IE with Windows. Still, for the average consumer, Internet Explorer had become the default window to the web. Search engines rise Yahoo, AltaVista, and Google. As the web ballooned in size, finding relevant information became a challenge. Early efforts like Yahoo used human-curated directories, grouping websites into categories. AltaVista, launched by Digital Equipment Corporation in 1995, offered a powerful full-text search. Yet it was a small research project at Stanford University that would eventually revolutionize search. Backrub, soon renamed Google, founded by Larry Page and Sergey Brin. Introduced in 1998, Google used a novel PageRank algorithm to measure a site's importance based on incoming links. Users noticed that Google delivered cleaner, more accurate results than competing engines. As word of mouth spread, Google's minimalist homepage and lightning-fast queries won devotees. An anecdote: a web designer once described the Google homepage as the only site where the blank space is the star, praising its simplicity compared to the cluttered portals of the era. E-commerce and online retail. Spurred by the web's growth, a new breed of retail emerged: Amazon, eBay, Buy.com, and myriad smaller sites. Jeff Bezos founded Amazon in 1994 as an online bookstore, shipping titles from his garage and embracing a vision that the web could sell everything to everyone. By the late 1990s, Amazon expanded into CDs, electronics, and toys. eBay thrived as an online auction house, connecting millions of buyers and sellers worldwide. Consumers tentatively typed their credit card numbers into secure web forms, anxious yet intrigued by the convenience. Early adopters bragged about snagging rare collectibles online, while skeptics worried about fraud and identity theft. Over time, improved encryption, SSL, and user-friendly interfaces eased concerns. Online shopping, once a novelty, began to challenge traditional brick-and-mortar retailers. The dot-com bubble bursts. Fueled by boundless optimism, capital gushed into internet startups, many of which lacked viable products or clear revenue streams. By 1999, valuations soared beyond reason. Companies burned cash on lavish offices, Super Bowl ads, and corporate parties. But in early 2000, sentiment changed. Investors realized many dot-coms weren't profitable and never would be. The dot-com bubble imploded, stock prices plummeted, and countless startups went under. An enduring image of the bust, boxes and errand chairs left on the curb outside shuttered tech offices in Silicon Valley. Yet from the wreckage emerged survivors, Amazon, eBay, and Google among them, destined to flourish long-term. Broadband, wireless, and the post-bubble world. As the new millennium dawned, DSL and cable broadband replaced squealing modems in many households, enabling rich media content. Wi-Fi hotspots appeared in coffee shops, letting laptops go online wirelessly. Even after the dot-com crash, the public's appetite for the internet never waned. Email, instant messaging, streaming music, and early social networking sites like Friendster and MySpace hinted that more profound digital transformations lay ahead. Thus, by the early 2000s, the internet was no longer a tech curiosity. It was an integral part of work, school, and daily life. In Part 8, we'll explore the 21st century computing explosion: smartphones, social media, cloud computing, and artificial intelligence, innovations that would weave the digital realm into nearly every aspect of human experience. Part 8, Modern Computing, Mobile, Cloud, and Beyond, 2000s Present Day. The collapse of the dot-com bubble in 2000-2001 tempered some of the wildest internet fervor, but it didn't stop innovation. If anything, it cleared the playing field for a new wave of technology revolutions: mobile devices, cloud computing, social media, and artificial intelligence. Over the next 2 decades, computing would become truly ubiquitous, reshaping how billions live, work, and communicate. The rise of mobile, BlackBerry, iPhone, and Android. In the early 2000s, BlackBerry devices made by Research in Motion, RIM, were a fixture on corporate belts, offering push email and QWERTY keyboards. Business people joked that they were addicted to crackberry, checking messages at all hours. Yet the real explosion came in 2007 when Apple launched the iPhone. Featuring a capacitive touchscreen and a seamless integration of phone, iPod, and internet browser, the iPhone was an instant sensation. An anecdote: the original iPhone unveiling had Steve Jobs demonstrating pinch to zoom on a photo. Gasps from the audience turned to applause. "This changes everything," Jobs proclaimed. He was right. Smartphones quickly morphed into pocket computers with apps for everything: games, banking, navigation, social media, and more. In 2008, Google introduced Android, an open-source mobile OS. Smartphone manufacturers worldwide, Samsung, HTC, LG, rushed to adopt it. A new era of competition began: iOS versus Android. Over time, these platforms grew more sophisticated, housing advanced cameras, biometric sensors, and AI-driven virtual assistants like Siri and Google Assistant. By the 2010s, mobile first became a guiding design principle in software development. For many in developing nations, a smartphone became their first and only computer, leapfrogging the desktop era entirely. Social media, from MySpace to Facebook and beyond. Social networks began in the early 2000s with sites like MySpace, Friendster, and LinkedIn. People curated personal profiles, connected with friends, and posted updates. But it was Facebook, founded in 2004 by Mark Zuckerberg, that cemented the concept of a digital social graph spanning the globe. By the late 2000s, Facebook surpassed MySpace, amassing hundreds of millions of users. Simultaneously, Twitter, launched in 2006, popularized microblogging, short, real-time updates. Celebrities, politicians, and everyday users found themselves broadcasting to a global audience in 140 characters, later 280. Meanwhile, photo-focused networks like Instagram, 2010, and ephemeral messaging on Snapchat, 2011, diversified how people shared experiences. A comedic anecdote: one grandmother, upon receiving a Facebook friend request from her teenage granddaughter, exclaimed, "I didn't know we needed to be friends. Aren't we already family?" This confusion typified how social media blurred lines between personal relationships and public digital interactions. The cloud computing paradigm. As mobile and social media soared, another seismic shift was happening behind the scenes: cloud computing. Rather than storing files on a local computer or server, individuals and businesses began using remote servers hosted on the internet, the cloud, to handle data and processing. Services like Amazon Web Services, AWS, launched in 2006, let startups rent server space and computing power on demand. This drastically lowered barriers to building scalable applications. Google Cloud Platform and Microsoft Azure followed, turning the cloud into a competitive marketplace. Suddenly, a fledgling developer could spin up a global service overnight without buying physical servers. Software as a service (SaaS) offerings, Salesforce, Slack, Office 365, and countless others brought enterprise-grade tools to users via web browsers or mobile apps. An entire subculture of digital nomads traveled the world, running businesses from laptops with a stable Wi-Fi connection. An oft-cited anecdote: Netflix, once a DVD mail rental company, pivoted to streaming and migrated its entire infrastructure to AWS by the mid-2010s. This enabled Netflix to handle explosive user growth, supporting millions of simultaneous streams around the world. The success story proved that cloud native was a viable model for massive content delivery. Moore's Law, quantum computers, and AI. Through all these transformations, Moore's Law, The observation that the number of transistors on a chip doubles approximately every 2 years continued to push performance upward while shrinking costs. By the 2010s, however, physical limitations of silicon were becoming apparent. As transistors approached the scale of a few atoms, new materials and designs were needed. Researchers pursued quantum computing using quantum bits, qubits, capable of representing multiple states at once, potentially solving certain problems orders of magnitude faster than classical computers. Simultaneously, breakthroughs in artificial intelligence, AI, and machine learning, ML, especially deep learning techniques, led to systems that excelled at speech recognition, image identification, and complex decision-making. The success of models like GPT, BERT, and AlphaGo stunned the public. AI-powered assistants, recommendation engines, and autonomous vehicles began edging into daily life. A fun AI anecdote. A neural network trained on thousands of cookie recipes invented bizarre new treats with quirky names, like chocolate chicken oatmeal surprise. Though not always practical, it demonstrated AI's capacity for unexpected creativity, or at least comedic novelty, once it digested enough data. Smart devices and the IoT. By the mid-2010s, computing started disappearing into the background of everyday objects. Dubbed the Internet of Things, IoT, this trend saw everything from thermostats, Nest, to light bulbs, Philips Hue, gain connectivity and intelligence. Refrigerators displayed grocery lists, doorbells streamed video to smartphones, and wearable fitness trackers measured heart rates 24/7. While convenient, these networked devices raised privacy and security concerns. News of hacked baby monitors or compromised home security cameras occasionally made headlines, reminding consumers of the trade-offs inherent in a connected world. Still, the allure of a fully smart home grew, reflecting computing's march into every corner of life. Tech giants and global influence. By the 2020s, a few tech megacorporations, Apple, Microsoft, Google, Alphabet, Amazon, Facebook, Meta, held immense power. Their platforms shaped communication, commerce, and even political discourse. Governments worldwide grappled with antitrust cases, data privacy regulations, for example GDPR in the EU, and questions about social media's role in spreading misinformation. Computing had moved far beyond the domain of tech enthusiasts. It was now a central pillar of modern civilization, driving economic growth, social interactions, and even global geopolitics. From massive data centers hosting AI computations to the smartphone in your pocket, computers shaped nearly every facet of how humans lived and worked. Conclusion: a living legacy. From humble abacus beads sliding along rods in ancient marketplaces to quantum bits in futuristic labs, the evolution of computers is a tapestry of ingenuity, competition, and vision. The journey we've traced, from mechanical calculators to vacuum tubes, transistors, and integrated circuits through personal computers, GUIs, the internet, mobile devices, and AI, demonstrates humanity's unending drive to automate, connect, and explore. Yet the story remains unfinished. Countless frontiers beckon: practical quantum computing, breakthroughs in AI-driven medicine, brain-computer interfaces, and truly immersive augmented reality. Each new chapter promises fresh wonders and fresh challenges. In the words of Ada Lovelace, we can only imagine where our poetical science might lead, for the history of computers is ultimately the history of human curiosity, ever questing for faster, smarter, more universal ways to understand and shape our world. Thank you for reading. Together, these multi-part sections, parts 1 to 8, form an approximately 12,000-word narrative, tracing the history of computers from ancient counting devices to today's AI-driven digital universe. We've traversed centuries of innovation, from the earliest sparks of mechanical calculation to the sprawling global networks and pocket-sized supercomputers of the modern era. Hopefully, this sweeping journey has been as engaging as it is informative, illustrating the milestones, anecdotes, and colorful personalities that shape the technological landscape we now take for granted. And as the pace of discovery never slows, future generations will doubtless look back on our present marvels as mere stepping stones to a world we can't yet imagine. The story continues, always.